kingdom come. Let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It is Wednesday, July 22nd, and this is Alessandra, and it is time for another edition of 2 o'clock break with Allie, and I hope that you are happy and healthy today. I wanted to start today with a little story. There was a fourth grader who was celebrating his birthday, and however had broken his ankle, so he was walking on crutches, and it was difficult for him to balance the cupcakes his mother had made for the class and walking on these crutches. So the mother, seeing that, asked the older brother if he would help him, and the older brother said, no, I don't want to. So the mother, thinking that this was a good teachable moment, said, what would Jesus do? And he said, well, Jesus would heal him so he could carry his own cupcakes. So there you go, the little story for today. On Friday, I had talked about three of God's promises. The promise of God's will, the promise of God's comfort, and the promise of God's presence in our life. There are two other promises that I wanted to talk about that are essential for our Christian faith. The first one is God's promise of freedom. And isn't that something that we all want to experience? Well, what is it that God is actually offering us? In the Bible, it is clear that God is constantly trying to deliver his children from either a physical slavery, like the Israelis from Egypt, or a spiritual freedom, which is actually more important. And in chapter 3 of Genesis, God had created this perfect world and a perfect home in the Garden of Eden. Unfortunately, humanity decided to reject that and reject God. And so therefore, every generation from Adam and Eve on has to deal with original sin. But God being God, he is constantly trying to give us the chance to be reborn. And so if we want the freedom, if we choose the freedom and we want the freedom of God, then we need to cast off or throw away things that are not good for us. Anger, hate, unforgiveness, envy, jealousy. These are all things that weigh us down. And so we have to decide to cast them aside and decide that God's freedom and living in God's freedom is worth living, and it is a life worth living. The second freedom, which is also just as important and maybe even more important, is God's promise of Jesus's return. And so what does that mean for us? Without the promise of a better world to come, we experiencing pain and suffering. And if we do not see or do not believe in a better world to come, then that's all we're going to have, and that's all we're going to live is pain and suffering. But every story has an ending, and it is, and our story is written by God, and God also writes the ending. And God is so good and so loving, and He is determined through our belief in Jesus Christ to give us an abundant life with hope and peace and a place in heaven. However, if there is going to be a time of suffering for the people that decide that they do not want to believe in God, and there's also a good time on the other hand for people that do believe in God. And so please, I ask you please to turn your hearts back to God. Let God's love and know that this life is not all there is for us. This is just a drop in the ocean for what is in store for us if we believe in Jesus Christ. So this is not the end of our story. Let our story be a positive one. Let our story end in heaven with God. Really, in my mind, there is no other option. So on Friday, I am going to try to chat about how we know that Jesus is not just a prophet and he is the Savior of the world, and he says who he says he is. So until that time, like my father used to say, I will see you next time, God willing. Bye, everyone. See ya.